Hi, everyone. So it's, I'm just going to start my timer here. There we go. So yeah, I live in Ontario now, so it's a real pleasure to come back home to Nova Scotia. And what I'm going to present to you today is the major thing I worked on all last year was a Canadian energy efficiency policy scorecard. So I am a policy person. Don't ask me how to insulate your house. I argue why other people should do that work from a policy perspective. So in this presentation, I'll introduce you to this scorecard, the methodology we followed, and I'm going to provide a snapshot of some of the most interesting results from a Nova Scotia perspective. So first, just a brief introduction to the organization I'm working with now, Efficiency Canada. We are a national research and advocacy organization. We're acting as a national voice for an energy efficient economy. And we officially launched about 1.5 years ago, and we're based out of Carleton University. So why are we talking about energy efficiency? So I think you all know this, but efficiency is all about the services we actually want. We want warmth, we want light, we want mobility, we want productivity, and it just doesn't make sense to have energy waste in the provision of those services. So the energy we save, it's a big resource. So just last year, there was a Canada-wide efficiency potential study, and that study showed that the energy we save could provide 40% of those energy services by 2050. And the saving that energy, it's also a big economic sector. It's often overlooked. So again, last year, there was a study looking at adding up all the people who work in energy efficiency, and that sector employs more people than the oil and gas and the telecommunications sectors in our economy. So let's get into the scorecard. What is it? So if you want to go to our website, you can download the entire 190-page report of the scorecard. We released it in November. And so we're taking a scoring approach because it provides a transparent and an evidence-based assessment of provincial energy efficiency policy frameworks. So we tracked both quantitative outcome metrics as well as more qualitative policy metrics as best we could. And so our plan is to update this now on an annual basis, and we want to get a dynamic ongoing picture of progress in each of the provinces on policy. So the provinces were scored out of 100 points across 5 different categories. So we had categories for programs, what we call enabling policies, buildings, transportation, and industry. So the weighting across these categories is informed by that potential study that I just talked about earlier. It showed that the largest potential for energy savings is in buildings, closely followed by transportation, and then industry. So the more cross-cutting areas, what we're calling enabling policies and programs, we looked at the American scorecard that they've been doing for 13 years to assess the weights for that, and we used our own judgment on those areas. So this is a more detailed breakdown of all the metrics we followed, and even within those, there's sub-metrics. So this, in the programs area, you can see we're tracking spending, we're tracking savings levels. We also wanted to track programs targeted to more hard-to-reach populations. So this year we tracked low income or energy poverty. Enabling policies, some examples of what we mean by that are financing programs, grid modernization programs, research and development. So the best thing to do is perhaps leave this with you. You can go into the report and dig into a specific area that is of most relevance and of most interest. So the other thing we launched is our policy database. So if you want to go get summary information on energy efficiency policies in each of the provinces, this is the place to go. So you can look at this database, you can look at a specific policy area and compare across provinces. You can also go look at a particular province and all their different types of policies. So this is, this hasn't gone viral, but for the people who work in energy efficiency policy, we know this is a very important tool. We're getting some pretty positive feedback about it. We're going to update this annually as part of the scorecard process, but we're also hoping that the public, folks like you, can help us. If you know that there's a policy change in your jurisdiction, please let us know and we'll update this database. So like I said, we released this scorecard in November. It received coverage in 150 media outlets in every single province in the country. We did a lot of that media outreach ourselves, but we also followed a strategy of working with local activists who really, I hope, use this scorecard as a tool. So many of the op-eds, many of the press releases that got sent out when we launched this scorecard didn't come from us, it came from local activists. So here in Nova Scotia, an op-ed was written in the Chronicle Herald by Emma Norton, for instance. Okay, so here are the results in the form of a map. British Columbia got the top score in this year's scorecard, closely followed by Quebec, Ontario, and then Nova Scotia. So here's a more detailed showing of those scores in each of the categories, and I'm going to highlight Nova Scotia throughout this presentation. So Nova Scotia ranked 4th overall, but it ranked 1st in this programs category. British Columbia's leading position is largely due to quite progressive building code compliance policies. Quebec's score is largely driven by policies to support vehicle electrification. Now, Ontario did well in a lot of the categories. It didn't lead in any one category. That score for Ontario would have been much better if it wasn't for some recent cancellations and policy backtracks in that province. So another thing these scores are showing you is that all provinces have areas to improve. The highest score was 56 out of 100. For each of these metrics, we set that high bar, what we consider to be best practice, what we consider to be very aggressive yet achievable benchmarks, the type of ramp up of energy efficiency that we really need to see if we're going to take climate change seriously. So I just want to say we're purposefully not providing letter grades. These are not A's, B's, and D's and F's. They should not be interpreted as such. I'd say that score of 100 is more like the summit of a mountain that we're all trying to reach towards. We're striving to reach. Okay, so next I want to get into some results that are of particular interest to Nova Scotia. So one area of Canadian leadership where this province is leading is electricity program savings. So this is looking at 2018 or 2017 data on annual incremental savings from programs. So that's looking at the savings that were achieved by programs operated by Efficiency Nova Scotia, largely here, from the measures installed in that year only, okay? So we took those savings and we normalized across the provinces by dividing by the, geez, I'm getting text messages here, sorry. We divided by the total energy sales in the province. And so the latest data we could get on this, Nova Scotia scored second, just behind Ontario. So I want to just make the note that, of course, these are annual incremental savings. So, of course, these savings accumulate, right? Because those measures installed in, say, 2018 will keep saving energy in future years. So I think the latest numbers I saw in Nova Scotia is that if you look at the role of electricity savings, those savings are contributing about 11% of those electricity services in the province, I think, last year. So that's the Canadian perspective. You can also look at this from a North American perspective. And so here I'm comparing our results to the results that you can find south of the border in their scorecard, and we made sure that the metrics were comparable. So in North America, Nova Scotia would be the 12th highest savings last year. And so that's pretty good. But you look at the leaders like Massachusetts, Vermont, they are consistently hitting 2% savings, almost 3% annual savings. And definitely the modeling, the potential studies that I'm familiar with in this province, they've shown that 2% savings are cost effective in a province like Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia could be striving to join these leading states from a North American perspective. So another thing we tracked is programs focusing on reducing energy poverty. So for this is actually a special census tabulation giving energy poverty rates per province shown here. And these rates are pretty high per province, right? What we're defining energy poverty here as is defined as a household spending more than 6% of their after-tax income on home energy costs. So that excludes transportation, but it includes all the other energy sources regardless of fuel. So why are these quite high? Well, one reason is because a substantial portion of the population that have relatively high energy burdens are working poor or perhaps seniors with fixed incomes, right? So Miriam Rezai, who's the researcher we got these data from, she makes the point that energy poverty is quite imperfectly correlated with, low-income cutoffs. But this measure of households experiencing energy poverty is more relevant for energy efficiency policy than, say, a low-income cutoff measure, because we want to know what households can receive the best benefit from interventions to reduce energy usage, right? Versus a more general poverty metric where, the way to fix poverty is increase people's incomes, basically. So we collected information on the spending for programs in each jurisdiction that were targeted to low and moderate income populations per province, and we divided that number by these energy poor households. So here Nova Scotia is quite far ahead in terms of spending, and in each of these top 3 jurisdictions, you can really see the influence of policy. So Nova Scotia committed to an objective back in 2014 to retrofit every low-income household. Manitoba has had a special affordability fund focused on low income for a number of years. Now, Manitoba here is also definitely helped out by relatively low energy prices compared to the other provinces. And PEI is making really substantial investments in reducing demand in oil-heated homes in particular. So another area we tracked was training certification. So the indicator I'm presenting here is the number of existing home energy advisor certifications, and we normalize that for the number of houses in each province. And so here again, Nova Scotia's way ahead, and I would love to get people's insights on this and thoughts on this. Part of what is driving this result, I think, is that energy advisors in Nova Scotia actually serve the broader maritime region. So we felt that, this still is a valid thing to score on, a valid metric. It actually shows that Nova Scotia seems to have turned energy advisory services into almost an exportable service. The other factor I think that explains the results in Nova Scotia is consistent support for programs that drive demand for these services and using the EnerGuide framework, throughout all the programs in Nova Scotia. So in BC, for instance, I know they've seen a real boom and bust in energy advisors that couples with the boom and bust of their programs. So here I'm going to present some areas where Nova Scotia is doing fairly well but could catch up. So one area is the adoption of building energy codes. So Nova Scotia's traditionally been quite forward-looking in this. They've adopted the 2015 National Energy Code for Buildings. Other provinces just very recently have adopted the 2017 version. Now that should be a fairly big jump in improvements according to the sort of national average, which suggests a 8 to 12% improvement. And in Canada, though, we're moving towards what's called tiered codes, right? Which is a series of higher performance steps moving towards net zero energy ready buildings. So this is a new approach for building codes. We're focusing more on where we need to go and not just the minimum standard or that lowest common denominator. And in Canada, this approach was pioneered in British Columbia through the introduction of what they called the STEP code. So in British Columbia right now, there's these series of steps. In some municipalities that have the political support or the administrative capacity, they are actually, new buildings in those jurisdictions have to meet step 3, higher performance than just the minimum. So this lets some of those jurisdictions lead where they're able, and it shows where we're going in the future, how buildings will need to be built in the very near future. So this is, because of this policy, this is an area where British Columbia received a lot of points in our scorecard this year. And there's a real opportunity now because there will be a model code coming out which will be based on these tiers that Nova Scotia can adopt. Another area we tracked is energy rating and disclosure policies for buildings. So this could be a requirement that when a house is sold, it has to have an energy rating for that buyer. It could be a requirement that larger buildings need to report and disclose their energy performance. And I think this is of particular relevance here in this conference, which is about energy data. So if we had quite accessible and transparent building level data, I'm sure a lot of you can appreciate, that would really help create a functioning market for energy savings. It would help identify those buildings with the most need. It would help improve operations in those buildings. So in Canada right now, we have a number of voluntary programs out there. There's one in Nova Scotia right now, where if you look at the Viewpoint Real Estate website, you can see the energy rating. And I understand that there's one that's either in place or will be launched for larger building benchmarking. But what really drives, I think, making energy a fundamental component of real estate transactions and building operations are mandatory reporting and disclosure programs. And the only place that exists right now is in Ontario for larger buildings. So just to give you a picture of the effect that might have, this is looking at the total number of building floor area reporting into Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which is a frequently used energy reporting and management tool. And so we divided this by commercial institutional building floor area to just get a rough comparison. So Ontario is in first here, which I think gives you a picture of the impact of their policies. We couldn't get Nova Scotia specific information, but Atlantic Canada is not as far ahead, at least in participation in these benchmarking programs. So I'll also briefly mention we track transportation. So this is looking at electric vehicle charging infrastructure. It's looking at number of charging stations per road kilometer. So provinces with a long history of EV support policies, Quebec, BC, and Ontario are in front here. This is an area where, you know, smaller provinces like the Maritimes could actually catch up quite quickly. So I want to conclude by talking about what can we learn from this scorecard. How can Nova Scotia become, win the scorecard next year and future years, become the national energy efficiency leader? So first, I think it's really important to celebrate the national leadership that this province has in programs. But that doesn't mean that more could not be done here. To maintain this leadership, the Nova Scotia government could require that the utility board make energy efficiency the priority resource, right? So that would mean investing in all energy savings opportunities that are lower cost than new energy supply, and thinking about that whole planning process in the context of achieving a net zero emissions economy, which I understand is now the provincial goal. Programs can also be supported by setting objectives to replace the use of heating oil, right? And that is a strategy that combines lowering that heating demand and then switching, I think, over to higher efficiency heat pumps. I think the major need, though, is for the provincial government to implement mandatory policies that complement this leadership in programs. So as seen in the last slide, Nova Scotia could bolster EV charging. That can be done through a variety of different ways, like zoning bylaws, building codes, as well as public charging programs. The development of a national tiered energy code for buildings is a big opportunity coming up. So we could see Nova Scotia making a commitment to adopt this tiered building code and to say that in the future, all new buildings will be net zero energy ready. And finally, implementing mandatory energy labels and benchmarking. This is all about using the power of better data, right? To raise awareness about energy usage, to create a functioning market for energy savings, scaling up those energy savings by identifying, those highest priority buildings and improving operations within those buildings. And this is an area where this province seems to have all the prerequisites. There's a high number of energy advisors, there's a high number of energy managers in comparison to other provinces. There's experience with a voluntary program already. There's advanced meters that are now being rolled out, and there's people like you who I think know how to use that data and make use of it. So I want to finish with this recommendation, because this is an EnergyDATA Workshop, and this policy means more energy data. So what we need to do is we need to show our policymakers that better energy data can save the world, and you can do it through that data. So I want to end with a bit of a call to action here for energy data nerds in this room to unite and demand a mandatory energy reporting program in this province of Nova Scotia in the future. So with that suggestion, I'm happy to take questions.